Welcome to What the Washington Season 2, a historical, social, and political tour of the weirdest state in the nation. We're back. We have a great list of episodes coming up, and we're excited to be able to host some interviews this season. This episode is one of those interviews, and we're just going to jump right into it. So I just wanted to say welcome. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the episode.
Well, and also like the water bottle I grabbed, very fitting. It has the
Oh, there
see
you
the North
go.
Cascades Grizzly Bear.
Wow, come on.
I was filling it up and I was like, oh, this is great. And then I also have like bear spray and other stuff that I can like bring out and show you guys a little bit if you want to like talk about some of like the bear awareness coexistence type stuff. So
Yeah, that's gonna be great.
cool.
I'm very excited. So we're joined today by Robb Krehbiel, former staff at the Defender of Wildlife Grizzly Recovery Program during the Obama and Trump administration. And welcome, Robb.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming and joining us. We're very excited to talk about Grizzlies. I think we both love bears. We named our softball team after the black bear, but it's close enough.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we wanted to. Well, originally I was gonna name it Grizzlies, and then I was like, there is a Grizzlies team, so I can't kind of just grab their thing. But
Well, if it makes you feel any better, black bears ecologically are much more successful of a species than grizzly bears are. So you can they're the most common bear that we have in North America. So you
we
can put
love.
that little feather in your cap.
Yeah, it's great. It's one of our favorite things is trying to find. So when Michaela was making the uniform, trying to find a not grizzly bear outline because every team is like, we want a grizzly bear, and it's like, what about the black bear?
Gotta avoid the hump. We're trying to find non-humped bears.
Non-humped bears.
So we're just really glad to have you. You're our first guest, so you get the gold medal for that.
That's exciting. I didn't
Yeah.
realize that.
Yeah, we're branching out. It was just originally Michaela and I, but we were like, we are not experts on wildlife and different species. Let's talk to people who are.
Cool.
So just give us a little bit about your background and why you got into working with grizzly bears.
Sure. So my background, academically, I have a bachelor's of science in environmental science and a master's in conservation biology. I did my master's thesis on looking at grizzly bear population connectivity in the Northern Rockies. So how like bears in Yellowstone and bears in Glacier National Park can move across the landscape to get to each other. And then I worked for Defenders of Wildlife from 2017 to 2021. And I was the lead program staff for our efforts to promote grizzly bear reintroduction in the North Cascades and to also promote bear awareness and coexistence with communities across Washington living alongside bears. Um, I have always been a big wildlife geek. I was that kid who like was watching Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom on Sunday mornings. So I've just always liked wildlife. I'm also guilty of really liking charismatic megafauna.
Yeah.
It's easy to like fall in love with bears. They're like so goofy looking. But yeah, I really have enjoyed working on sort of the intersection of people and wildlife and where conflict sometimes happens,
Mm.
and finding ways to reduce the likelihood of conflict and promote coexistence. So that's me in a nutshell.
Yeah, it's always fascinating to think about like how we get into the different things that we focus on, like wildlife, different species, because I think about my experience and it's very similar. A lot of Nat Geo, a lot of watching Nat Geo and as a kid and being out here in Washington and like going all over the country after, just moving around a lot. and seeing different places and being like, that's fascinating. I wonder what the things that crawl and creep in creeks look like here, and they're all different. So it's really fun.
I personally really like watching Big Fat Bear Week in
Yes.
Alaska. That's my favorite. I'll keep it on like just on one monitor in my at work. One monitor is Fat Bear Week, one monitor is my actual work.
Do you fill out the bracket?
I vote sometimes.
Vote. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Good, good.
I Fat Bear Week.
It's my favorite.
It's great.
Um, so I just wanted to ask because you told in a different meeting that we had a long time ago, you
Hmm?
kind of talked about the history of grizzly bears and humans interactions in North America, primarily United States. And I just wanted to kind of like hear and hear some of that history because you kind of taught me some things that I didn't even know anything about. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So grizzly bears were once pretty common throughout the Western United States. California has the grizzly bear on their state flag. That's because there were grizzly bears found there. Aldo Leopold, who is a sort of like father of conservation wildlife sciences, he was writing about grizzly bears in New Mexico and Arizona when he was with the Forest Service, and that was decades ago. And then, of course, there's a lot of First Nations and indigenous cultures across the continent that have stories about grizzly bears, who have special relationships with grizzly bears. So they have been present and on the landscape for a long time. And today we have grizzly bears, and you think about them mostly in the woods, but grizzly bears were actually adapted to also be out on like the prairies and the plains. So when Lewis and Clark were coming west on their journey, they actually first encountered grizzly bears like in the Dakotas,
Wow.
instead of like out in the forest. And if you think about how a grizzly bear is like shaped, they have like these giant, massive claws. They're really just like big shovels, and they do a lot more digging. Whereas like the black bear claws are a little shorter because they climb trees a little bit more. So grizzlies will live in the woods, but they actually are a little bit better adapted to be out on the plains, and living out there. Um, but with a lot of different carnivores on this continent, as sort of Western expansion of like white settlers and manifest destiny was happening, there was just a lot of just over extraction and overuse of tons of different resources. So there was habitat loss that was happening across the Western United States because of white colonialism. But also, predators were just not tolerated. And it was largely because of the growing ranching industry that was happening out in the Western United States. Grizzly bears are they're an omnivore. They eat everything on the landscape. There are actually some bears in Glacier National Park that are almost strict vegetarians, which is really interesting. Um, in Yellowstone, you see a lot more sort of like meat consumption, and that's because in Yellowstone they're like hunting calves of bison and elk and things like that. But bears aren't they're in terms of like their predation, grizzly bears are not like the most effective predator on the landscape. Like wolves, those will ruin your day. Grizzly bears, they're like a little lazy when it comes to like accessing their food because they can eat whatever, and it's easier to eat things that are not running. But that means that like if you're ranching cows or sheep, especially during calving season, those animals, those babies are really susceptible to carnivore consumption. And there also are instances where bears are like taking out adult sheep and adult cows. So because of that, the ranching industry and the federal government, to support the ranching industry, went on extermination campaigns. Like I mentioned, Aldo Leopold at the top, he was in the Forest Service during that, and he has like this beautiful essay about when he killed a wolf and just sort of seeing the green fire in her eyes die out, and that was like a really life-changing moment for him and how he was viewing our like interaction with wildlife on the landscape, because we kept getting rid of carnivores for the sake of propping up the ranching industry and making those livestock safe. But then we were having explosions of deer populations and other things all over the place. So there was this cascading ecological effect where grizzly bear removal was part of that. So today we have a few remnant populations of bears that are left in the lower 48. Most of the grizzly bears are up in Alaska, but we have big populations in Yellowstone. That population actually has been through a lot of controversy the last decade over whether or not they should be delisted from the Endangered Species Act. But they're probably one of our better populations. And then the population around Glacier National Park, the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem. Those are our two sort of big centers for grizzlies today. And then we have a few other recovery areas that have a few hundred bears at best, but in the North Cascades, which is what we're talking about, there haven't been a grizzly bear sighting in there since the early 90s, I think. So it's mostly assumed that there are no grizzly bears currently in the North Cascades.
Yeah, that's fascinating. When I was in my master's program, one of the things that we just learned is just how do you like disrupt wildlife the most is like just put enclosures everywhere, right? Basically, like you divide up the landscape, and so like that bear that could roam around and do things that it would have been able to do, 200 years ago, now can't even, go anywhere because all the free space is taken up, all that area that used to be food or habitat is just gone. So it's fascinating to see that even with a predator or what we consider an apex predator, it's still impacted by that division of the land because guess what? It affects everything up the
Yeah.
scale. Yeah, it's fascinating and for up here in Washington, that's a big thing because we have also a pretty robust agriculture and ranching industry as well. So kind of getting into that, do you have, I mean, for you, do you have any background knowing anything about that North Cascades population and like the historical background of it? And then like, what does the reintroduction process look like that was being discussed and now is like underway?
Yeah. So the North Cascades population, just very similar to what happened through grizzly bears throughout the lower 48. So people just hunting them. And also like this was before the time of the Endangered Species Act. So it was legal for anybody to just shoot whatever they wanted to. And like, yeah, it was literally the Wild West. So um, they were just hunted a lot and just persecuted a lot because of the perceived threats. There were also like instances of bear attacks. There still are today. So people also perceive them as just a threat to their personal safety as well when they were out on the frontier. So, yeah, the last confirmed sighting of a grizzly bear, it was in the early 1990s. There was a guy who was out hiking up in the northern part near the Canadian border and saw a bear on the ridge and got some photos. And it's a little bit like Bigfoot photos, actually. Like there was a morbid sort of bet, not really morbid, but there was a bet that like, will you find Bigfoot or a grizzly bear in the North Cascades first? Which one's more likely? But this guy got some photos of an outline, and it was a humped bear. So that's one of the dead giveaways for grizzlies. It's not colored. That's something that a lot of people think about with bears. Just as a quick side note, we call them black bears, but black bears come in all different colors. So I don't know why. I think black is probably the most common color, which is why we call them black bears. But you cannot rely on color to identify a bear. So, anyways, this guy took a photo, nice big hump with a grizzly bear, very clearly on it. Since then, there have been folks who have taken some photos of bears thinking that they might be grizzly bears. In some cases, they've been just identified as a very large black bear, or just not really sure what identification we have on it. But there has been so much effort to try to find bears out in the North Cascades for just decades. And we just are not turning anything up in terms of finding grizzlies. Lots of black bears, but grizzly bears, we're not really finding them. So, yeah.
So when you do you have a specific boundary when you're saying North Cascades? Like how far south into the Cascades does that go? And did historically were they on the east side as well? Since you talked about, grizzlies used to be prairie bears as well. Does that like was that part of their region as well?
Yeah, so I'll answer the first part of your question first. So yes, absolutely. And one of the places where you can find grizzly bears in Washington is called the Selkirk Mountains. It's up in the very northeast corner of the state. And that mountain range spans northeastern Washington and parts of the Idaho Panhandle. And there's a small, but I think last time I checked, slightly growing population of grizzly bears out there. So they were out there for sure. They were also, there's sort of a very sagebrushy rolling hills landscape between the Rockies and the Cascades. So they would have been all over in that area. It's perfect grizzly bear habitat. The Blue Mountains down in the southeast corner of the state, whenever I go backpacking out there, I'm like, oh, this is great grizzly bear habitat. Why don't we have them here? We're not talking about putting grizzly bears in the Blue Mountains, we like collectively, but I think it'd be a good idea. But in terms of the North Cascades, so we have North Cascades National Park, obviously, and then there's a lot of Forest Service wilderness areas around it. It's about, I think it's like over half of the defined ecosystem is protected as park or wilderness area. So that's one of the reasons that it's been identified as like a really great spot for grizzly bears, just because it's so protected, and grizzlies are kind of sensitive when it comes to habitat. Um, but the ecosystem itself, it spans the mountain range, so it goes out into the foothills on both sides of the mountain, like in those protected public land areas, and it goes from the Canadian border all the way down to I-90 that cuts sort of across the center of the state. So it goes like pretty much into the center of the state, and it's my hope that someday that grizzly bear population is large enough in the North Cascades that a few bears will find the wildlife crossing structures that we built over I-90 and make their way down to Mount Rainier National Park, which I think would just be so cool to see that just iconic species of the American West on this like beautiful mountain that is just so representative of our state. So yeah.
Yeah, it's always fascinating. Like there's like all this existing infrastructure to kind of connect our habitats back together. And with the idea of like these reintroductions are just one of the more popular, I wouldn't say popular, but most well-known reintroductions or not are the wolves
Mhm.
from up here. And you know, it would just be great for those species to kind of return. And that's actually one of my next questions was um what would be the benefits and like why should we reintroduce these species to this area? Because you'll have probably some people who will be like, it's a big killing machine. Why do I
Yeah.
want this? And you kind of talked a little bit about it earlier, but I think that it's good to kind of talk about the fact that there's not just explicitly like just for the sake of having an animal back, which is also, I don't think, an unjustified want, but there is also habitat benefits and things across the board on that. So, yeah, what do you think about that?
Yeah, well, I think that the debate and discussion around that is a little bit different than with wolves, because wolves came back on their own.
Yep.
Like they were building up good populations in Montana, in Idaho, and then they made their way back. So wolves were kind of like, well, they're here and we just have to deal with them. The grizzly bear question with the reintroduction is more of like a conscious choice that we're making to like bring that species back. So um for me, like I've mentioned before, like I think that bears are just great and awesome, but like I also live in Tacoma, so I don't have to like, have a grizzly bear showing up on my back porch potentially. So I understand completely some of like the concerns and reservations that folks have about living with a new species on the landscape. That being said, it can be done, and there's a lot of good reasons to bring the bears back. We mentioned some of the ecological cascades that happen when you start taking away top carnivores and other species like that from the ecosystem. That's absolutely true with grizzly bears and bears in general. The other thing with bears, though, is because they're omnivores, they serve a dual function of sort of keeping ungulate populations in check by predating on calves and things like that. but they also are major seed dispersers. There's like a lot of like studies that people take grizzly bear and black bear poop and then sort through it and grow the seeds that come out of it. And there's a whole forest in bear shit. Like, who knew? But it's beautiful. And another thing with grizzly bears, like I mentioned, that they do a lot of the digging, that disturbance that they do, and especially in like certain alpine meadows, helps to actually increase some nitrogen fixation within the soil, which makes it healthier for the plants there. So there are a couple of studies that showed that grizzly bears doing that can increase meadow biodiversity overall. So and I think just like in any species reintroduction, I think the goal should always be to make sure that an ecosystem is as intact and as complete as it was prior to some of these major disturbances that were imposed on it. Like extinctions happen for sure, but the extinctions and extirpations that we as a human species and more specifically like settler colonial sort of project of expanding into the West, those actions are have like thrown off just like thousands of years of evolution, striking a really nice balance. And so I think it's time, like it's important for us to be restoring those harms that we've caused so that natural processes can continue, ecosystems can be more resilient, and that we can just sort of continue having these healthy places function the way that they evolved to function.
So, what would a successful reintroduction, like what measurement would be used to see if it was a success or fail? Would it just be population growth, or is there other benchmarks?
Yeah, great question. So the successes are, I would have to go back and look at it, but I think it is primarily based on the number of breeding females is one of the measures of success. Population number is also one, and I don't think that this one is included in the current proposal. You'll have to fact check me on this one. But in some cases, you will also measure success by occupancy. So you don't want like all your, I'm making up numbers. If your goal is 100 bears, you don't want them all concentrated like in one section. You kind of want them to be dispersed out throughout the ecosystem. And then females also are super important, just for every species. Like the future is female, so everyone should just get used to that. Um, but especially in terms of reintroduction projects, you want to be translocating young females and young males because for a couple of reasons. One, that's sort of the time when grizzly bears are starting to leave mom. Grizzly bears are probably one of the clingier species when it comes to hanging out with mom. Cubs can stay with their mom. Males are on average 2 years, and females are 3, sometimes 4 years. And there's a lot of research in places like Glacier where there's just tons of food on the landscape. Moms and daughters will overlap ranges, sometimes up to 50%. Like they're happy to share space and resources with each other, especially if it's like a really productive space. So, yeah, that's sort of how you would measure the success.
It doesn't work. Are there contingency plans? And I'm specifically recently for us, especially up here in Bellingham, the mountain goat reintroduction
Oh yeah.
did not go well. And so it seems like a lot of people are looking at that as an example of what grizzlies will do. And for those who are listening and don't know, we tried to reintroduce mountain goats to, I believe, a similar location in the North Cascades, and it did not, the population dwindled to very few mountain goats over a very short period of time, I think like 2 to 4 years.
Yeah.
And they had species problems like hoof rot, especially, was a big problem for them. So, how would what's sort of the evaluation process if it's going well? And if it's not going well, what are the plans to help it?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think the mountain goat example, that was such a really heartbreaking story because it was, I don't know, I was looking forward to it and that success, but the hoof rot, it's just that's a hard one to deal with. So I, first of all, with all of the reintroduced animals, they are monitored like crazy by the scientists who are reintroducing them so that they can find out about what's going on. That would be the same with these grizzly bears that get reintroduced. They would all have radio collars on them. Occasionally, we'd try to find them and just check on them to see how they're doing. So I think if there was anything sort of disease-wise impacting bears, that would probably put up a couple of red flags and be like, there was something in the ecosystem that we were not accommodating for, and we need to reevaluate this proposal. Um, Generally, though, the federal government has a long, successful track record of reintroducing bears and translocating bears. We do that quite a bit. Sometimes it's bears that get into trouble where they go into cabins, and there's a three strikes policy in most states for bears. So on the second strike, you normally capture them and try and get them as far away from people as possible. But also in the Cabinet Yaak Mountains in Idaho, bears were moved from Glacier National Park over there, and that was a successful reintroduction effort. But there are individuals who are probably going to die during the process. And part of that is they'll be hit by cars or accidentally shot by hunters. We have a black bear hunting season out here, and mistaken identity is a thing that happens with bears. In terms of how they'll measure success, I think that I'd have to go back and look at like the actual plan itself, but I would imagine that they have sort of some thresholds and limits where they would say something like we can't just keep throwing bears into the ecosystem until one sticks. So I think that there's a certain threshold where they will say, okay, maybe we need to stop and reevaluate. But from what I have seen of Fish and Wildlife Service and National Park Service work in the past with grizzly bear translocation, I have a lot of confidence that there's going to be success here. There was a lot of studies that were done to show that there is ample food resources for bears in the North Cascades ecosystem. They're not super sensitive to the impacts of climate change because, again, they live in a whole host of different ecosystems. So they're pretty adaptable in that sense. And with the amount of protected land that we have in the North Cascades, that's another thing that gives me a lot of confidence that there's going to be success with this reintroduction effort.
Great. And so going back just a little bit, so you were talking about the average age that cubs leave their mothers. So those are the ages of the bears that they would be bringing to the North Cascades. So they'd be the
Most likely.
juvenile. Okay.
Yeah, and that's partially because that's the stage where they would be dispersing anyway. So they're not going to have like a home range already set up that they're going to be like, I got to get back to this place. Although, given how far away the North Cascades are from Glacier National Park, which is where we're planning to get the bears for the reintroduction effort, that's going to be a really long journey. But bears have done that in the past. Like there are some bears who are really good at trucking across the landscape. So we may see instances in which the bears that we put into Glacier National Park will leave the park and like try to go back.
Right.
I think what's more likely though, because bears are pretty lazy, I think that they'll stick around for a good chunk of time. But yeah, we'll be getting those sort of young bears to send them over. And then that also for like female purposes is just um, you can get younger females, which means that you can increase the population faster because it's more opportunities for mating for them to have cubs. And that's super important for grizzly bears because they're such slow reproducers. They're one of the like slowest reproducers of the carnivores that we have. Like wolves will have a whole litter of pups every single year. Grizzly bears will have one, two, sometimes three cubs once every like 2, 3, or 4 years. And grizzly bear mortality for cubs is pretty high. Unfortunately, one of the things that a lot of carnivores do, including grizzly bears, is if a male wants to mate and a female has cubs, he'll just kill the cubs so that the female will be more willing to mate with him. Um, so that happens quite a bit in grizzly bear world, which is sad. So.
Yeah. Yeah, it's always a challenge. I did find it interesting you just when you were talking about their age range, and the image of grizzly bears like ultra competitive for like space, and the fact that they're willing to share with other grizzly bears, especially family. I think that that's kind of interesting just because you don't think about that. You're like, I think there's a lot of like, oh, like once the cub gets too old, they just, never see each other. It's like, no, if the resources are enough,
Yeah.
that's an important fact to remember.
Yeah, and like it's interesting, you'll see like radio collar data on wolves, and like they very clearly have like boundaries between packs of like where they do and don't go. But even with male bears, they will overlap quite a bit. If there's enough food, they will just be chill with each other. And from like a population standpoint, that then discourages them from leaving the ecosystem. So um, dispersal normally happens when resources are limited. So again, because there are ample resources for bears in the North Cascades, I think that the bears that we put there are going to be like plenty of stuff here, no need to move. I'm just going to be a fat, happy bear in the woods of Washington.
One question I have, and it's more on the human side and the legal side. What protections exist already for bears that are going to be, especially these ones that are moving into this new area? But
Mhm.
like you were talking a little bit about the Endangered Species Act. What does that do for endangered species? Like what kind of legal protections does that provide for those creatures?
Yeah, so any species listed under the Endangered Species Act cannot be taken, and that means you can't kill it and harvest it, but it also means that you can't harass it, you can't um, like make it uncomfortable and like force it to like flee or anything like that. So um, it's interesting like in the whale world, so like if you're around an orca and like you're chasing an orca with your boat, that's considered a take even though you're not actually taking that animal out of the water, you're still violating the Endangered Species Act in that way. So grizzly bears are listed as a threatened species under the Endangered Species Act. It's one step below. We have endangered species and threatened species, but the protections are pretty much the same. And for this population, though, they're being reintroduced through a special rule within the Endangered Species Act. It's called 10J, and it designates this as an experimental population. And I think it's a non-significant experimental population. So, like, what that means is that this is a population that we want to recover. Like, this area has been designated as a recovery area for grizzly bears. But if we don't have bears there, it's not that big of a deal in the grand scheme of things in terms of like extinction for the species. We will still have grizzly bears even if they are not in the North Cascades. We want them in the North Cascades, but not having them there doesn't spell extinction and doom for the entire species. So with the 10J sort of designation for this population, there is more flexibility for active management of it. So in the cases here, I don't know if this got into the final rule, but there were discussions about allowing for allowing for like a three strikes rule for grizzly bears out here. So if they continue to be a habitual source of conflict with people after the third time, they would be euthanized by the state. There's also more leniency in terms of like penalties if you shoot a grizzly bear for accidental identification of black bears, or you're fearing for your life and you need to shoot it. So it allows for a little bit more flexibility, a little bit sort of heavier hand of human management on the species. Um, so yeah, I don't know what the specifics are for the 10J rule that are being moved forward, but it's not as protected as grizzly bears in Northeast Washington, which are fully protected as a threatened species under the ESA.
So I guess that leads us to a good question, which is there's seems to be a good number of, especially farmers, who are
Mhm.
really opposed to grizzly reintroduction. We certainly see that a lot in North Whatcom. I have friends on Facebook who live out in in the farmland who are really opposed to grizzly reintroduction. Is there I guess what would be the primary argument for those who are opposed? Is it just safety and livestock? And I suppose what's your rebuttal to those oppositions?
Yeah, so safety is one that I hear a lot. I also hear that from folks that like live in Seattle and like going hiking out in the woods, you know, like I want to be safe when I'm out recreating. Livestock is something that gets brought up quite a bit. Although again, I think that like the amount of livestock that is around the North Cascades is not super big, but there are a lot of orchards out there, and grizzly bears love fermented fruit that's on the ground. And if they come into your orchard because they smell that fermented fruit, they'll be like, oh, and look at all this fresh fruit that are still on the trees. So they'll start eating that too. In Montana, there are also grizzly bears who come out of the mountains and go into cornfields to snack on corn. And not only are they eating it, but they're also rolling around because they're giant bears and destroying the corn that is growing there. So they can definitely have an impact on, agricultural communities for sure. Um, that being said, there are ways to mitigate that. And the farming and ranching community has always been an industry and a community that has had to manage risks that are beyond their control. You think about diseases impacting livestock, bad weather and droughts impacting crops. There are things that they always have had to adapt to. So first of all, this community is used to being adaptable. Second of all, there are farmers and ranchers who are extremely successful outside of Yellowstone National Park, which has one of the largest grizzly bear populations. And they're dealing with it because they've been able to put in simple tools like an electric fence around their cows. They've been able to change up how they manage their livestock. So instead of leaving carcasses out on the range, collecting it so that it's not an attractant to bring a bear close to the rest of your cows. So there are things that you can install to reduce the likelihood of grizzly bears impacting your crops. Electric fences are actually wildly successful. That's one of the things that I worked on, and Defenders of Wildlife, where I used to work, still does a lot of, is putting electric fences up around any sort of attractant, especially in places like Montana. So putting it around fields, around beehives, around backyard chicken coops. We put up an electric fence in Northeast Washington around a community dump because bears love trash. I don't know why, but they love trash. So we put those up, and just bears are babies. And when they get a little zap on their nose, it freaks them out enough. It's foreign enough that it has been a strong enough deterrent for them to turn away and find resources somewhere else. Because again, if you can eat everything on the landscape, you find the easiest thing to eat on the landscape.
Right.
And an electric fence is a barrier enough for a lot of them. So that's one thing. And then on the safety side of things, there are tons of different things that folks can do to be bear aware out in the woods, which we can dive into more if you want. So.
I was gonna say that was actually my next question, was just on it. I don't like to always just do like on an individual level, but on like a personal level, or like even if you're a person out on a town that has a pretty big wildlife and urban interface. Like the city is like right up to the forest. Like I think of Bellingham because that's where we live. What can a person or like a city, medium sized or small sized city, promote to their citizens to, like, be able to be bear safe and be bear conscious without having to have that first impulse is like, I gotta shoot this bear or something like that.
So one of the projects that I worked on when I was at Defenders was in the town of Winthrop, with the folks who live in the Methow Valley.
Big fan of Winthrop in this household.
Listen, I ain't never met a Winthrop hater in my life. Like, but there was a group out there that was really excited about grizzly bears, and they wanted to do this exact thing where they're like, we are in a town where we have like elk and black bears and all sorts of things walking around all over the place. So they wanted to get out ahead of potential conflicts with grizzly bears, which I think should be one of the main goals of this reintroduction effort, is like avoid conflict as much as possible. So what they did and what Defenders of Wildlife helped them to do was we worked with their local waste hauler to start switching out some of their usual trash cans with bear resistant trash cans. And these are special ones that are super heavy duty that bears cannot break into because once a bear figures out how to access a resource like trash, they're gonna keep coming back to access that resource. So these bear resistant trash cans are really helpful at deterring that learned behavior. I also worked with an orchard out in Washington to put up an electric fence around their property. And then we worked with a couple of different recreational groups to train them on how to be bear aware out when you're hiking and how to use bear spray, which is a non-lethal tool that we can use to get rid of a bear if it's starting to threaten you. It's basically like mace dialed up to 11 or 12. So bear spray has actually kind of a sad history. Like the way that it was tested was there was a bear who was in captivity and they just would keep spraying it in the face until they were like, oh, this is the dosage that works. So yeah. Thank you for your sacrifice, I guess. Sad bear in cage. But yeah. But it's a great tool and it has been shown to be effective, more effective than using guns at deterring grizzly bear attacks because grizzly bears are hard to kill. And if you shoot it, you're just gonna piss it off more.
Yeah, that's growing up around here and having a lot of friends who were hunters and even, my dad talking about hunting and stuff, and it's just like if you're using even a hunting caliber rifle on a bear, you're gonna have to like do more than just one shot because it's not enough to take it down. So especially grizzly bears, but it's just interesting to me that we are so in some parts of life we're so kind of like we can handle it, and there's still that kind of like misconception that oh, if you shoot it or this, that, it's like actually the more effective thing is one, try to avoid those
Yep.
interactions in the first place, but then two, having a chemical option, which is repellent, is
Yep.
far more effective because bears are extremely sensitive in their nose and mouth.
Yeah. Well, and like this bear spray is awful stuff. Like, I've gotten it on my hands before and like it just stings you there. It's capsaicin is the main
Uh-huh.
ingredient in there. So it's just one of the and it's also something that if you ever get bear spray on you, you should take a cold shower. Do not take a hot shower because then your pores open up and that capsaicin gets deeper into your skin. So you take a cold shower to try and rinse it off, and then you just have to wait it out. And it is the
Uh-huh.
most uncomfortable wait that you have to deal with. But yeah, it's crazy. Like there's a lot of studies that came out from Alaska even that in instances where there were hunters who were encountering grizzly bears, the hunters that used bear spray as opposed to their hunting rifle to deter the bear, it was like 90% of those folks avoided the bear encounter when they deployed the bear spray. Like the bear attack did not happen. And of the 10% that it did happen, it was just minor injuries and they were able to get out and get to safety. Whereas the folks who were shooting it, like 60% of those folks had a bear encounter. Like the bear just got mad. And for grizzly bears in particular, they typically only attack if they perceive you as a threat. Like grizzly bears do not look at you and they're like, "Oh, I'm gonna eat you." Like there's been a couple of horror stories, but on the whole, like grizzly bears will only go after you if you are bothering it or pissing it off or presenting some sort of risk. And that's why most bear attacks that we see with grizzlies involve cubs and moms because that's something that they are like just known for. I mean, Sarah Palin coined Mama Grizzly. Oh God, I just brought up Sarah Palin. Oh, anyways.
Well, I think that it's interesting because, yeah, I think about all the like kind of like the culture around like the bear in the US, and like I think about like the teddy bear, and I am like, oh, that was because of a baby cub, separated from its mom after a hunt, And I'm just like, yeah, that's why a bear will attack you.
Yeah.
Like that story is explicitly why you shouldn't.
And
I
that story's made up.
Yeah,
That's
it's
good
fake story.
propaganda.
Yeah.
I am unfortunately part of the club that is, if it's not a friend, why is it friend shaped? Does it have cute ears?
Yeah,
There,
it's like the same thing in Yellowstone. Like people would be like, "Oh my God, I love this bison. I'm gonna go pet it." And it's like that bison's gonna throw you 20 yards away.
yeah, they're big animals. Like that's the thing. In Coopville, there is a bison farm, and and man, I stood next to it, and I'm 6'2". Like I stood next to that thing, and it was massive.
Yep.
So if I, anybody who's like thinking about the megafauna, the charismatic megafauna, I'm like they're the megas there. It's a
Yeah.
big creature. And bears, I think they do receive kind of like a little bit of that projection of our own fear of the outdoors, the outside, because it is a pretty sharp creature. They're not dumb animals.
Yeah.
They're pretty smart. So I think that it's interesting that we kind of like it's like, oh, you're out there and there's a bear. It's like, yeah, well, bears are out there, of course. Like if a bear was at the city, would they freak out because there are people in the city? It's like, yeah, because that's where people are too.
Yeah.
Like it's funny like that.
Well, like not to get too philosophical on you, but like something that you just said, Matt, about sort of like how we as like human society project a lot of our like feelings onto bears. Like that, one of the reasons that I think grizzly bears are so just great in general is that they having them on the landscape and sharing the landscape with grizzly bears is just a very humbling experience. Like the times that I have been out like backpacking in Glacier or in Yellowstone, like you just have like this sense about you where it's like I am not the top dog on this landscape. And like it's a little nerve-wracking, it's a little exhilarating, but at the same time, like I also go into those experiences knowing how to avoid conflicts and then knowing how to manage those conflicts if they happen. So first, I think that like it's important that people are prepared when they go out there, but I really encourage folks to like have those experiences because it really does, I think, for me at least, sort of resituated like how I view myself within this landscape and this ecosystem that I'm in. And it builds more of a connection to the non-human pieces of our community. So yeah, that's I think grizzly bears help to do that.
Yeah, the official what the Washington stance on wildlife is that humans are part of the ecosystem. They are
Yep.
above the ecosystem.
Yep.
Is there anything you wanted to add that we didn't ask about?
Yeah.
I mean, I just think everyone should carry bear spray with them when they go out hiking. Not only, so this is one of my pet peeves is that people think that bear spray is only needed when you are in grizzly bear country. Bear spray is not called grizzly bear spray. It is called bear spray. And if you are hiking in Washington, you are most likely hiking someplace where there is a healthy black bear population. And black bears will ruin your day just as quickly as a grizzly bear will. So please carry bear spray. And also, I think it's important that folks learn about bear awareness and how they can avoid conflicts. The number one tool that we all have is our voice. Bears of all species do not like people. We've talked about the history. We've given them a lot of reasons to not like us. But a human voice has been shown to be one of the most effective deterrents at preventing a grizzly bear or black bear attack. Do not get bear bells. Those are garbage. Bear bells, the sound that they make, do not carry nearly as far as a human voice. So all that you're doing is just driving yourself and your friends crazy with that incessant dinging. So just talk to your friends while you're hiking. Don't drive them crazy with a bear bell. And I think that those were my last pet peeves that I have about bear awareness things.
I mean, the bear spray is important. I'm gonna go get some because we live in Bellingham and we have black bears everywhere.
Yeah, only a few months ago there was a black bear hanging around not far from our neighborhood. So
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a good thing to have, and it's a good thing to just keep on you when you go out into the woods, because it also helps if there's a creepy guy. So if you're like on a trail and you're faced with bear or man, you could use bear spray for both.
Matt was going to title this episode Bear or Man, based on, like which one would you rather encounter in the woods?
I'm gonna go with bear on this one.
Oh, hands down. Like everybody, the people who are upset about like the people who pick encountering a bear versus a random man, like statistically, you are more likely to be murdered by a human man than a grizzly bear. So,
It's just the
uh,
numbers. I don't understand why everyone gets mad about that.
yeah, no, it's like, yeah, I don't know. Men, on behalf of men, please calm down.
Yeah, well, that's exactly where we were like, that's a silly question because it's clear the numbers are already there. I don't understand why everyone is having a hard time, but that's a great place to leave it. And thank you so much, Rob, for just taking some time out of your busy schedule to talk to us about this.
I love talking about bears all day, every day.
Yeah, it was a great having you. Thank you so much.